On December 14th, 1972, a man named Gene Cernan climbed a ladder on the lunar surface, and no human being has stood on the moon since. That's not a story from decades before space travel existed. It happened after 12 people had already walked there, after we had rovers driving across lunar dust, after we had the technology, the rockets, and the trained astronauts sitting ready for more missions. And then, almost overnight, we simply stopped. Here's the part that should bother you. NASA didn't run out of rockets. There were 3 fully built Saturn V vehicles, capable of carrying more crews to the moon that were never launched. One of them sits on its side today, rusting slightly, on display outside a museum in Houston, a monument to a mission that never happened. So if the hardware existed and the astronauts were ready, what actually stopped us? The answer isn't a single event. It's a chain of decisions made in offices thousands of miles from the moon by people who had never intended for Apollo to last forever in the first place. And the men who flew those missions have spent the decades since trying to explain what most people got wrong about why it ended. For most of history, human beings assumed the moon was untouchable. Then, in a single decade, that assumption collapsed. Apollo 11 landed in July of 1969, and for a brief moment, it felt like the beginning of something permanent. 6 more landing missions were being planned. NASA's own internal charts, drawn up before Armstrong's boots ever touched the surface, showed lunar missions continuing on a regular basis, with talk of permanent bases and eventually crewed trips to Mars. That was the plan people believed in. It is not what happened. To understand why, you have to understand what Apollo actually was, underneath the science. The program had never really been about exploring the moon for its own sake. It was a Cold War weapon, aimed not at Soviet cities, but at Soviet prestige. President Kennedy had framed it explicitly as a race, a way to prove which political and economic system could achieve the impossible first. Once the United States landed astronauts on the surface and planted a flag, that particular goal had already been accomplished. The single defining reason for spending enormous sums of money on the moon disappeared the moment Neil Armstrong's foot touched the dust. That's the part that surprises people. The mission wasn't really about the moon at all. It was about being first. And once you've won a race, there's no political prize left for running it again. You'd expect that with the goal achieved, the program might slow down gradually. Instead, the cancellations came almost immediately, and the timeline is more brutal than most people realize. Apollo 20, the final mission on NASA's original list, was canceled in January of 1970. Only 6 months after Apollo 11, 2 more missions, Apollo 18 and Apollo 19, were canceled shortly after. In the end, 3 full lunar landing missions that had already been planned, funded, and assigned crews were simply erased from the schedule. But here's what makes this stranger than simple budget cutting. The cancellations began before Apollo 13's oxygen tank exploded on the way to the moon in April of 1970, an incident that many people assume was the turning point. It wasn't. The first mission was already canceled 3 months before that near disaster ever happened. Whatever killed Apollo, it wasn't fear of another accident. The decision had already been made. There's another detail that makes the timing even harder to explain away as a simple safety response. The 3 canceled missions weren't leftover redundant landings. Apollo 18 had been assigned a crew that included a professional geologist, the first scientist ever slated to walk on the moon rather than a test pilot. Apollo 19 and Apollo 20 had target landing sites chosen specifically because they were geologically different from anywhere. Previous missions had explored, including possible landings near craters like Copernicus and Tycho, places thought to hold clues about impacts that shaped the moon's surface. These weren't repeat trips. They were designed to answer questions the earlier landings hadn't touched. So the missions being cut weren't the least valuable ones scientifically. In some ways, they were shaping up to be the most valuable, which raises an uncomfortable question. If the science was getting better and the hardware already existed, what exactly made those 3 flights expendable? So if it wasn't a disaster, and it wasn't a lack of hardware, and it wasn't a lack of scientific value, what was it? Follow the money. And a very different story starts to emerge. At its peak in 1966, NASA's budget consumed nearly 4.4% of the entire federal budget in the United States, an extraordinary figure for a single agency. Project Apollo alone was eating up roughly 70% of NASA's total spending. That kind of commitment is almost impossible to sustain once the political urgency behind it fades, and by the end of the 1960s, the urgency was gone. The Soviet Union had quietly abandoned its own crude lunar program, meaning the race America had been running no longer had a competitor. At the same time, the country itself was changing. The war in Vietnam was consuming enormous amounts of federal spending. Domestic pressures, from civil unrest to economic strain, were pulling political attention toward problems back on Earth. public opinion polls from the era reveal something that contradicts the popular myth of Apollo. Support for continued moon missions rarely rose above 50%, even during the height of the landings. Americans were proud of what had been achieved, but the pride didn't automatically translate into support for spending billions more to repeat it. This is where the story usually gets simplified into Congress cut NASA's funding, and that's true, but it skips the more revealing decision, the one made inside the White House itself. In 1969, a presidential task group had proposed an ambitious roadmap for what should come after Apollo: permanent lunar bases, a large space station, and eventually, crewed, missions to Mars. President Nixon rejected nearly all of it. According to space policy, historians who have studied internal White House communications from that period, one of Nixon's top aides told NASA plainly that the president did not believe there was a need to keep sending crews to the moon again and again. The administration had no appetite for continuing a fast-paced, high-cost exploration program once its political usefulness had ended. It's worth sitting with how deliberate that rejection was. The task group's proposal wasn't a fringe idea from junior staffers. It had been assembled at the president's own request by a panel that included NASA's administrator and the vice president, and it represented what the space agency itself believed should logically follow an achievement like Apollo. Nixon's team studied it and largely shelved it. The historical record suggests personal politics played a role here too. Nixon had little interest in expanding a program so closely associated with John F. Kennedy's legacy and space policy. Historians have noted that in his own public remarks about Apollo's achievements, he rarely credited Kennedy for setting the goal in motion at all. That single decision reshaped everything that followed, and its most immediate casualty was the Saturn V rocket itself. Rather than keep the production line running for future missions, NASA shut it down. Once that decision was made, there was no simple way to reverse it. The tooling, the specialized manufacturing lines, and the supply chains that had built the most powerful rocket ever One more sustainable path through Skylab and the shuttle was on the table. That reframes the mystery slightly. It wasn't only Congress saying no, and it wasn't only Nixon saying no. In important ways, NASA said no to itself. There's also a colder, more clinical argument buried in the archives, one that rarely makes it into the popular telling. In a 1971 internal memo, the government official overseeing the federal budget argued in favor of preserving at least some Apollo missions, specifically because canceling them would put large numbers of specialized scientists and technicians out of work, at a moment when the broader economy was struggling to absorb that kind of talent elsewhere. Apollo, at that point, was being weighed not purely as a scientific triumph, but as a jobs program balanced against welfare spending and urban Apollo's defenders inside government were arguing for it in the language of economic trade-offs and employment statistics, not exploration for its own sake. The romantic idea of Apollo as untouchable national pride had already faded by 1971, less than 2 years after Armstrong's first steps. What was left was a much more ordinary argument about jobs, budgets, and which programs justified their line item. That shift matters, because it means the why behind Apollo's ending isn't really one story. It's at least 4 separate ones, overlapping in the same 18-month window. A foreign policy goal that had already been met, a president without emotional investment in continuing someone else's vision, an agency hedging its own confidence in aging hardware, and a federal budget office weighing moon landings against welfare spending and unemployment. Any hardware, the funding pipeline, and the political appetite required to do so had all moved on to other things. Harrison Schmitt, the geologist who flew alongside. Cernan, and later became a U.S. Senator, has reflected that none of them at the time believed it would take 50 or 60 years to go back. Cernan himself, in the years before his death in 2017, repeatedly made a point that cuts against the assumption most people carry about Apollo, that the country poured a fortune into the space program. He noted that the United States has typically spent something on the order of half a cent out of every tax dollar on all of space exploration combined, a figure he used to argue that resuming lunar exploration was never really about affordability. It was, in his view, about whether the country still had the will to prioritize it. That's the deeper argument the astronauts have made for decades, and it complicates the simple "we couldn't afford it" narrative most people accept. NASA's total budget, even during Apollo, was never remotely close to the largest line item in the federal government. The real constraint wasn't the size of the check. It was whether political leadership believed the moon was worth writing that check for, once there was no Soviet flag to beat to the surface. This is where the popular narrative and the archival record really part ways. Most people who weren't alive for Apollo assume the country turned against the space program, that public enthusiasm curdled into resentment over the cost. The polling data doesn't support that story cleanly. Support for continued lunar missions hovered stubbornly under 50% for most of the decade, which means the public was never as unified behind Apollo as the footage of packed mission control rooms and ticker tape parades suggests. But that same public also never organized any meaningful backlash against the program while it was running. There was no large protest movement demanding NASA's budget be slashed. Indifference, not outrage, is closer to what actually ended it. Nobody was angry enough at Apollo to fight to save it, and nobody was inspired enough by the remaining missions to make canceling them politically costly. In Washington, the combination is often more dangerous to a program than active opposition because there's no constituency left to defend it when the budget office comes looking for cuts. So, what does this actually tell us about a mission most people assume ended because it was simply too expensive to continue? It tells us that Apollo's ending wasn't really about technology failing, or public interest completely vanishing, or a lack of scientific value in the remaining missions. It was the collision of several separate forces at once. A Cold War objective that had already been achieved, a president with no personal enthusiasm for continuing a program he associated with a predecessor's legacy, a domestic budget under pressure from a war and social unrest, and a space agency willing to trade away lunar landings in exchange for building an orbital future through Skylab and the shuttle. None of those individual reasons, on their own, would have been enough to end crude lunar exploration for half a century. It was the combination, arriving all at once in a narrow 18-month window between 1969 and 1970, that made the decision essentially irreversible. Once the Saturn V production line closed, once the political moment passed, once the astronauts and engineers who had built that expertise moved on to other programs or retired, restarting became a project on the scale of Apollo itself, not a simple matter of writing a bigger check. This is also why the return to the moon happening now, through NASA's Artemis program, looks so different from Apollo. It isn't built around a single political rival to defeat. It relies on private companies building the rockets and landers, rather than one government program owning every piece of hardware. And it has taken years longer to reach the launch pad than Apollo did, precisely because so much of the infrastructure, expertise, and political urgency that made the 1960s possible had to be rebuilt from close to nothing. Consider what that rebuilding actually involves. Apollo wasn't just a rocket design, it was an entire industrial ecosystem. Specialized welders who understood how to work with the exact alloys used in the Saturn V's fuel tanks, engineers who had spent a decade refining guidance systems now considered primitive by modern computing standards, and a manufacturing supply chain, spread across contractors in dozens of states, all coordinated toward a single deadline-driven goal. Once that ecosystem dispersed, in the sense that individual companies moved on to other contracts and individual specialists retired or changed careers, no single act of Congress could simply reassemble it. This is a big part of why Artemis, even with modern computing power that dwarfs anything available in 1969, has taken so long to reach its own crude lunar landing. The gap wasn't primarily a technology problem, it was a continuity problem, and continuity, once broken, is far harder to rebuild than to maintain. The astronauts who were there at the end have made their peace in different ways with what happened. Some argue it was a strategic mistake, a case of walking away from hard-won capability just as it was maturing. Others see it as the natural conclusion of a program that had always been a political sprint rather than a permanent commitment, and argue that Skylab and the shuttle represented a reasonable, if imperfect, alternative path toward the same long-term goal of a permanent human presence in space. It's worth noting that both perspectives can be partly right at once. Skylab and the shuttle did keep American astronauts flying for decades, building expertise in orbital operations that Apollo never touched. But that expertise came at the cost of surface exploration entirely, and it would be nearly 50 years before any spacecraft built for humans was designed to leave low Earth orbit again. What almost none of them dispute is the central irony sitting at the heart of this story. Humanity's return to the moon isn't waiting on some undiscovered technology, some breakthrough that Apollo-era engineers lacked. Most of what's needed was demonstrated successfully more than 50 years ago. What was missing wasn't capability, it was a reason compelling enough and a political system patient enough to keep the door open once it had already been proven that it could be walked through. Gene Cernan left the lunar surface believing the gap would be short. It became the longest pause in human exploration since our species first left the surface of Earth. And the question the men who were actually there keep circling back to isn't really about rockets or budgets or even politics. It's this. If we could do it once with 1960s technology and a fraction of today's computing power, purely because we decided it mattered enough, what does it say about us that once the point had been proven, we let the door swing shut for 50 years? And now that we're finally walking back through it, will this time be any different? Or will the same forces that ended Apollo eventually decide, once again, that the moon simply isn't worth the price of staying?